right. Welcome back. I'm Gilaross, author of Living Beautifully and host of the Power Up podcast, where we share short, relatable ideas to impact and upgrade your everyday life. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to have all of you here. It's great to see new faces every single week. It's really wonderful to see how this is growing. So keep on, let's doing it. Everyone bring a friend next week, right? We're currently in the middle of a series towards a more compassionate world, right? We looked at why it matters what we think about other people. We looked at empathy, and if you missed those, you can catch them up on the podcast. Today, we're going to move into the way we talk about other people. You may or may not have heard of the term before, Lashon Hara. What does Lashon Hara actually mean?
Evil speech. Evil tongue.
Evil speech, yeah. Evil tongue, evil speech, right? What's so terrible about speaking bad about other people? We're going to go into what constitutes Lashon Hara, because Lashon Hara is actually only one out of 5 categories of forbidden speech in Jewish law. What's so terrible about talking bad about other people?
Yeah,
You can't undo it.
And it hurts the person that's listening to you do it, also besides the person that you're talking about.
Someone once asked me the question, what's Judaism's view on Lashon Hara? Is it considered a sin? How bad of a sin it is? So I want to read you out what the Talmud says. There are 4 transgressions for which one pays in this world and in the next. Number 1 is idolatry. Number 2 is sexual immorality. Number 3 is murder, which incidentally are the big 3 in Judaism, that a person is supposed to forfeit their life rather than transgress one of these. And if you're curious as to why, we can discuss that in another class, because it's fascinating to understand why these are so important, that it's worthwhile giving up your life, because in Judaism, the value of human life is up there, right? Shabbat is important. If God forbid someone's life is in danger, we break Shabbat for it, right? That's how important human life is. Then it says, and Lashon Hara is equivalent in severity to them all. The Talmud is saying there are 3 big sins. There are 3 big things that we are not allowed to do in Judaism, right? And you're supposed to give up your life rather than do them. And Lashon Hara is comparable to all 3 of them, right? And if you think about it, it's a wild concept. Even if you've heard it before, imagine it's the first time you're hearing it. It's a wild concept, right? We know how destructive murder is, right? You're trying to tell me that me talking bad about someone else is equivalent to murder? Like, that sounds a bit wild. So let me continue, actually, by telling you a wild story. So there was a rabbi called the Chavetz Chaim. His name was Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, and he was called the Chavetz Chaim. Why? Because he wrote a book that is called, guess, any guesses? Well done, called the Chavetz Chaim. What is this book about? It's based on a phrase in Tehillim which says, Mi ha'isha Chavetz Chaim, who is the person who wants life, desires good life? And the answer that Tehillim, that Psalms gives, is guard your mouth from talking bad about other people. So what the Chavetz Chaim did in this book is he wrote down all the laws of permitted and forbidden speech in Judaism. And it was a book that really, I think, if we look at history, revolutionized this concept, that the phrase Lashon Hara now became like a household name, kind of. So many, just by a show of hands, and there's no embarrassment if you haven't, how many people in this room had heard of the word Lashon Hara before tonight?
Have not heard it?
Have. But everyone's heard about it, right? It's become a household name. And it's because of this book that he wrote. In fact, there's a calendar that was introduced later on, which splits up the book so that you can learn 2 laws a day, and you go through the calendar, you go through the whole book, I think every few months. And it really brought this severity and the laws of how we talk to and with other people to the collective consciousness of the Jewish people. So he's once traveling with another rabbi, and they're there to do some sort of spiritual job for the Jewish people. And they stop on the way, and they stay in one of those, like a guest house that was called in those days. And she put up the 2 rabbis, and as part of hosting them, she offered them a meal. So the next morning, as they're getting ready to go, she turns to the 2 rabbis and she says, "How was the food?" Chavetz Chaim says, "It was great." And the other rabbi said, "It was great. Thank you so much for having us. The food could have used a bit more salt." And the woman heard, and then she walked out. And the Chofetz Chaim was visibly distressed. And he turned around to the other rabbi and he says, I don't understand this, right? I have been so incredibly careful my entire life not to talk bad about other people. And then I come on this spiritual mission with you. It must be there's something wrong with the mission that we're doing, that I was put in this position where I am kind of a partner, a witness to this Lashon Hara going on. So the other rabbi says to him, like, what do you mean? He says, she asked me how it was. I said it was good. I thanked her for putting us up. All I said was it could use a bit more salt. I didn't say it was terrible. Come on, like what's the big deal? Chofetz Chaim says, you don't understand. This woman who hosted us, she probably doesn't cook the food herself, right? She probably employs someone. Now, who's she going to employ? She probably employs someone who is a widow or who is single, who needs to take on the job of a chef to support herself. Now, you said to the hostess, the owner of this guest house, that the food was lacking salt. So she's now going to go into the kitchen and she's going to berate the chef and say, how could you do that? We have these two, important, prominent rabbis. How could you not make sure that the food was up to standard? And the chef is going to probably say, to defend herself, what do you mean? I tasted it was fine. And they're going to get it, and the owner of the guest house is going to get into a fight with her and say, what do you mean you're accusing those rabbis of lying? And what's probably going to happen is she's probably going to fire her. And this poor widow who has no other means to support herself is now going to be left without a job. What do you think when you hear that story?
I'm having a hard time believing that the owner of the inn would berate her.
Sounds,
I mean,
if we could be honest, it sounds wild and far-fetched. Want to hear the end of the story? Right? So the Chofetz Chaim says, okay, fine. Let's test the theory. Let's go into the kitchen and see what's going on. So they walk into the kitchen, and lo and behold, the owner of the guest house is berating the chef. And the chef obviously is distraught. And the Chofetz Chaim and the rabbi goes over to the owner of the guest house and says, no, look, we don't want you to fire her. We don't want you to get rid of her. It was a small thing. He tries to patch it up. And the owner of the guest house was a good person. And she listened to him. She's like, no, I'm not going to fire her. I just wanted her to take it seriously. And I think the point of the story is that you think, I'll tell you my experience, because it may have been different for you. When I first read this story, I'm like, I can't teach this. This story is like wild, far-fetched. No one will believe it. Yet, I want to say something that I bet if I asked people in this room to think about a comment that someone said to you when you were a child that impacted your life, positively or negatively, I bet each of us could think of something, at least one. And sometimes those benign little comments that people say to us when we're young or whatever, they can have repercussions, right? We don't know what people are struggling with. When the rabbi said he could use a little bit more salt, did he think that, number one, this owner of the guest house is going to feel embarrassed and going to want to make sure that her place is up to scratch? Is he thinking that maybe there's a person on the other end whose livelihood depends on this? No. And it's the same thing. We say things and we don't know what it's going to trigger in someone else. Just by a show of hands, can anyone relate to this concept, this idea, this story of having something that was said years and years and years ago, that the impacts of it still impacts on your life?
of course.
Yes. Right? So that is why it's considered so terrible, right? In Judaism, because if you think about it, what defines us as human beings is that we can speak, that we can communicate with each other. No other species has the level of communication that human beings have. And our words literally have the power to build people up and to destroy people. We hear stories of people who get saved because of something someone else said to them. And God forbid, the other way as well, literally and on other levels as well. So that is why it is so important that's why it's put on such a pedestal in Judaism.
So just playing on the opposite side. So if somebody asks you for direct feedback. How was my food? And you don't give a complete answer. You say, oh, no, it was wonderful, it was wonderful. Aren't they trying to improve based off of the information they receive? And if you don't give that information, then they're not given the opportunity to improve.
Right.
Like
So-
if she didn't care about her food, she wouldn't have asked the question in the first place.
Or maybe she was just trying to, I mean,
when you are hosting somebody and you just think, how was the food? You know, like it would be asking for feedback.
You're asking a good question and a very important question. And Jewish law actually deals with this balance that we have to have in our life, right? That on the one hand, you're not allowed to hurt other people with your words. And on the other hand, you're not allowed to, you can't be dishonest, right? I'll give you an example, right? Someone comes to you, they've just bought a pair of shoes. And they say to you, what do you think of my shoes? And you think they look terrible on them. Should you say something or should you not say something? The point also here is to bear in mind is can she do anything about it, right? If they're refundable and she's asking you and she wants your opinion and you tell her, no, they look terrible on you or whatever, or in a nicer way, right? I think a different style would kind of look better on you, whatever it is that we kind of have to say, right? And she's going to then take it back to the store, then it's one thing. But if they are final sale, end of the line, no returns, no exchange pair of shoes, and you're just going to tell her, no, what have you done? You've made her feel bad and there's no recourse to it. So the laws of it, and we're going to get into that a little bit of that next week, right? When we look at when you can talk bad about other people for a constructive purpose. And that's the balance that learning the laws of forbidden and permitted speech in Judaism strikes, is the balance between, on the one hand, you can't destroy people with your words, you can't hurt their feelings with your words, and you sometimes have to say things in a way that can push people. And there's so many different categories. Like next week, we're going to focus mostly on the times where you are allowed to talk bad about people. But there's something in Jewish law called tochacha, which means giving a rebuke to someone else, right? Sometimes you're allowed to tell someone and you're encouraged to tell someone something that is doing wrong. The caveat of that in Jewish law, number one, is that you have to have that relationship with that person, that they're able to hear it from you, right? If they're not able to hear it from you, don't say it. When I learn these laws, I think it teaches us the beauty and the sensitivity that God expects us to treat other people with. Because you look at a situation like that and it's like, God expects us to be sensitive, thinking, caring individuals. You want my opinion? Great. But before I give you my opinion, let me think about whether my opinion is going to hurt you or help you. If it's just going to hurt you, then keep my opinion to myself. Yes.
How do you know, like if she asked my opinion and I said, are they returnable? I think she. I know what my opinion is.
It's a good question. And it's kind of, part of the thing, right? Like, and sometimes you got to be smart about it, right? You got to kind of like, oh, these are really nice. Where'd you get them from? And she kind of tells you, well, I got them final sale from whatever. Then you kind of get a clue. But again, it's that sensitivity that we're supposed to develop of measuring the impact of our words and how they're going to land with other people. Yeah, and it's interesting discussion in the Talmud of how you're supposed to compliment a bride, right, to the groom. And the crux of it at the end of the day is that there's beauty in everyone, right? So even if you can't see the beauty in the bride, find something. She's got beautiful ears, whatever it is, right? Like, again, because it's so subjective. I think the point, though, is to take out from these sort of questions and these conversations is, number one, these things are sensitive and our words have impact, and we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to be sensitive to how are my words going to land. This rabbi was like, oh, I'll tell her, I'll give feedback, I'll tell her this food needs a bit more salt, but he didn't realize the impact of what that's going to happen if you're hosting, the president's entourage in your house, and it comes back to you that the food wasn't salty enough. You're gonna feel really bad about it, right? There's another reason about why it's so terrible, right? Because God created the world. You may or may not have noticed this, but the world is not perfect, and it's not by mistake, right? Anyone notice? Anyone ever noticed? The world isn't perfect. It's not by mistake. God created an imperfect world. He created us imperfectly, and then he put us into this world and he said, partner with me and be my co-creators in helping bring the world closer to perfection. Now, when we understand the truth of this, we look at the imperfections within ourselves, within the world around us, differently. We look at them as these are things that God put me into this world to help move closer to perfection. God created me with, not enough patience, let's put it that way. It's not because I'm a terrible person. It's because this is something that God put me into the world and said, I want you to create a little bit more patience in your life. Now, a person who talks bad about someone else, what are they doing? They're doing the exact opposite. They are choosing to focus on the deficiencies, the weaknesses. And God says this is such a terrible thing that he and I cannot coexist in the same world. Why? Because God looks at our imperfections as things that we have to work on, right? It's progress. It's the little things that we do. And a person who talks bad about someone else is forgetting the purpose, right? What they're choosing to do is they're choosing to focus on the other person's weaknesses, on choosing to focus on the other person's deficiencies, instead of kind of looking at like, oh yeah, none of us are perfect. We all have areas to improve on. There's plenty of good things in other people as well. Is that clear? Right. So that is also why it's such a terrible thing to do. There was a story, and you may or may not have heard various permutations of this story, but there's a story of someone who said something negative about someone else. And they went to the rabbi and they said, Rabbi, I feel terrible. I said this horrible thing about someone else, and now, how do I fix it? So the rabbi says, I'll tell you what, go get a packet of seeds and go sprinkle them outside. So the man says, okay, that was easy. A packet of seeds and sprinkle it outside. So he's like, okay, great. That's easy. I can do that. And he says, come back in 3 days. So the man goes, gets the packet of seeds, sprinkles them outside. 3 days go back, comes back to the rabbi. And the rabbi says, so he says, what do I need to do now? He's like, now I want you to go and collect those seeds. And he said to the rabbi, that's impossible. And the rabbi said, that's how hard it is to take back our words. And again, it goes back to what we said is we don't know what people are struggling with. We don't know. We tell someone, oh, why don't you call that person? You don't know what type of relationship that person has with that person, right? You don't know the things that are underlying that you're triggering by saying these things to other people, right? You tell someone, and there's so many stories of this, right? I'm sure, again, we can all think of stories like that. I'll share a positive story with you, because it's nice to do positive things as well, right? Sometimes people ask me, like, why did you choose to become a teacher? And the truth is, I don't know if I did kind of choose to become a teacher or teaching chose me. I don't know, but whatever. And I often think back to one moment when I was a teenager and I was talking to a friend about deep, meaningful conversation, as teenagers sometimes do. And she said to me toward the end of the conversation, wow, you have such a great way of explaining things. You should become a teacher. And that simple comment sparked something within me, right? And years later, we're talking about, I don't know, 25 years ago that this story happened. I still remember it and I still credit it for pointing me in a direction that I may not have done otherwise. And I'm sure we can all kind of think of stories like that happen to us, positive, negative, and I'm sure we may not hear about it. We have also done things for other people like that. Okay, I want to talk about the 5 categories of forbidden speech in Jewish law. What are the 5 categories of forbidden speech? Okay, the first one is something called rechilot. What is rechilot? It's gossip. What does it mean? Is, let's say someone comes to me, and Jane comes to me and says something about Judy, right? And I go over to Judy and says, do you know what Jane said to you? said about you and tell her what was said about you. That is a category on its own that's called rechilot, right? Gossiping. Why is that so damaging? On a very simple level, how do Jane and Judy feel about each other right now?
Judy knows that Jane is talking about her, so she can't trust her.
Yes, it could destroy relationships. It creates disharmony, conflict, right? It just, again, we're in this world to make the world a better place, to create harmony, to move the world close to perfection. When we're spreading what someone else said about someone else, we're doing the exact opposite of it. So that on its own is a category of forbidden speech in Judaism. Someone tells you something about someone else, we'll talk about what you're supposed to do. Definitely not allowed to go back and tell the person who was spoken about what was, and that someone else was speaking about them. The second category is the one that's very famous, which is called Lashon Hara. Now, what comes under the category of Lashon Hara is, does anyone know, out of interest? The very common question that people ask when they hear about Lashon Hara is, Lashon Hara means you mustn't talk bad about other people. But what about if it's true? This is Lashon Hara, right? If it's true, you know that this person did X, Y, Z, and you go tell someone else, that is Lashon Hara. If it's not true, it's also forbidden, but it's a different category. Okay, it's called Motzi Shem Ra, right? Which is ruining someone else's reputation. You're spreading rumors that this person did X, Y, Z. It's not true. It's unverified, etc., etc. All of that would be considered Motzi Shem Ra. The fourth category is a very wide category, and this is called Onat Devarim, which literally means hurt, causing pain with your words. So any sort of comment that would cause someone else pain would be forbidden under this category. All right, so you can already see that something could come under more than one category, right? Because if you're going to Judy and telling her, do you know what Jane said about you? And telling her what Jane said. So it comes under the because you're spreading gossip. It comes under Lashon Hara because you're saying that Jane was talking bad about someone else, and it comes under Onat Devarim, right? Because you're hurting the other person with words. So you can multitask when it comes to talking badly about other people. But Onat Devarim is a very wide category. It really, again, demands and expects of us to think before we speak, to really think, how is the impact, going to land? Like, what if it's a joke? Would we be allowed to say something that's hurtful as a joke? No. And this thing of like, I was just joking, doesn't hold up in Judaism, right? You cannot hurt someone else's feelings with your words, even if it's a joke. And then the final category is called Avak Lashon Hara. So Avak Lashon Hara, the literal translation means the dust of Lashon Hara. So what's included in this is something that isn't strictly speaking Lashon Hara, but it either creates a situation where you would encourage someone else to speak Lashon Hara, or it's like it creates a taste of Lashon Hara, right? So I'll give you an example, right? Let's just say, okay, you've told Judy doesn't like Jane right now because of what Jane said about her, and now you start singing Jane's praises in front of Judy. What do you think Judy's going to say under those circumstances? She's also probably at some point going to say something not nice about Judy, right? Because Jane, whatever, I forget which one. That's the problem of using two J's, right? Right? I just wanted to choose names that weren't in the room, and I hope I did that, right? So that would be considered a situation of a Avak Lashon Hara. You're creating a situation where you're excessively praising someone, and it's going to cause someone in the room to talk bad about someone else, or you say something that is like a little bit snide or a little bit off-putting, right? Like someone says something and you roll your eyes behind their back or whatever, right? That is called Avak Lashon Hara because it leaves a bad taste about that person in their mouth. Okay, so those are the 5 categories. There's rechilot, which is kind of gossip. There's Lashon Hara, which is talking bad about other people when it's true. There's Motzi Shem Ra, which is spreading a rumor about someone else. There is Onat Devarim, any sort of words that we use that are harmful to someone else, and Avak Lashon Hara, like things that are subtle Lashon Hara. What's forbidden in these 5 categories? Is it forbidden to speak it?
Yeah.
Is it forbidden to write it?
Yes.
Is it forbidden to communicate it with our body language? Absolutely. Any sort of communication is forbidden. What about listening? Are we allowed to listen?
No.
No. So what do you do if someone starts talking?
Let's put something in.
What about the stuff that you already heard? You're not allowed to believe it. That's correct, right? So yes, you're not allowed to communicate it in any way. You're not allowed to listen to it. And if you've heard it already, you're not allowed to believe it, right? So that's what's forbidden in these things. Yes, Alina.
At my work, people love talking about each other. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but sometimes they just need to express their feelings. I listen to everybody, but I listen, and I think it helps. Even, those people who are talking, maybe, I don't know, it's true or not true, but bad things, but my role is like a therapist. I listen. I might be not thinking about it, but people just talk. Our supervisor didn't look at me in a good way, and people need to talk about it.
So you ask a fantastic question, and that's what we're going to discuss next week. We're actually going to spend an entire session next week on it, because you could very well leave this class and sit and think to yourself, oh my gosh, like I'm never allowed to listen to my friend vent, or I'm never allowed to, tell anyone else about anyone that's bothering me, or I'm not allowed to, maybe, is it wrong to go to a therapist? Is it because you're talking bad about other people? Is it right? What about if someone is, danger to society? Are we allowed to talk about them? So should I give you a spoiler in that? No. Come back next week and you'll find out whether there are some times where you are allowed to speak about other people. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'd love to hear your feedback, and if you enjoyed this episode, you'll love my book, Living Beautifully: How to Bring Meaning, Joy, and Love into Your Life, based on the timeless wisdom of Pirkei Avot. And please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out. Have a wonderful day.